Vagrant Story is one of those games that everyone points back to as one of the best PlayStation games. It's a game I didn't play back when it first came out, so I don't have the same lens of nostalgia that I look at it through. So I wanted to see if it's still a good experience for both newcomers and for people coming back to it after a long time. In order to understand an older game like this, you need to understand a few things about the history surrounding it and the developers who made it. So, we need to learn about a man named Yasumi Matsuno, one of the most celebrated Japanese role-playing game developers. Yasumi Matsuno had gone from Tactics Ogre to Final Fantasy Tactics, and now he was directing Vagrant Story, so he had a list of hits, and he's still going. Square was pumping out games that are now much beloved with the release of Parasite Eve in 1998, Threads of Fate, and The Legend of Mana in 1999, not to mention a team working on Final Fantasy IX the same year as Vagrant Story in 2000. Having that many big titles from a single developer in that period of time seems kind of ridiculous at this point, and maybe even then it was a little bit crazy, but that's just what Square was doing at that point. They were just pumping them out. Vagrant Story is a part of the larger world of Ivalice, a fictional world that Square has come back to time and time again, starting with Final Fantasy Tactics. They kind of call it the Ivalice Alliance at this point. Other games within the Ivalice Alliance include Final Fantasy XII, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, Revenant Wings, and a series of raids in Final Fantasy XIV, Stormblood. It's been a while since Ivalice has had another full game within that setting, almost certainly due to the fact that Yasumi Matsuno is no longer at Square, though he collaborates with them occasionally. Vagrant Story is a unique game, with a style of combat that really hasn't been repeated in the same way since, variation of combat that was originally created in Parasite Eve. And the only parallel that I could think of that's more current would be the Fallout series with the VATS system. The idea with the combat is that you press a button and a sphere moves outward from your character, and any enemy body part within that sphere becomes a valid target. It's a lot of fun to play with, and I think it has a lot of room to iterate, if someone really wanted to do that, but so far they haven't. You'll also have to stay engaged in order to get timed hits and do change attacks, similar to something like Super Mario RPG. The amount of damage that you inflict will massively increase when you do it correctly, so it's not something you can just safely ignore when you're playing the game. The combat isn't the only thing that makes Vagrant Story stick out. It has a different way of telling the story than a lot of other games. You make your way throughout the different locations, and you'll run into various characters, and a cutscene will start. It has a unique way of using the camera during those scenes, in part because they're still trying to figure out how to do it. In an interview in Vagrant Story Ultimania, they said that they were still experimenting with 3D space, and were watching a lot of American cinema in order to learn how to use the camera during certain scenes. They're also inspired by American comic books, which is why they used the signature speech bubbles from that form of media. Put all of that together with Akihiko Yoshida's incredible art style, and you have something that really hasn't been repeated since. But probably the most important question that I set out to answer here is, regardless of the game as an achievement from many years ago, is it still worth playing as it is right now? As I said before, I don't have the same nostalgia towards Vagrant Story that a lot of people have. I didn't play the game when it first came out back in 2000. I was much more interested in JRPGs like Final Fantasy IX at that point. I can say pretty definitively that I think the art style definitely holds up, even with some strange angles during different scenes. At worst, those scenes have charm, and at their best, they really pull you into the mystery as it unfolds. Vagrant Story thrusts you into the center of an ongoing story with very little background, pretty much none, and you have to adjust to unraveling not only what the other characters are doing, but the story of the protagonist, Ashley Riot, which very quickly pulls you in. The moment-to-moment gameplay reminds me a lot of current-day roguelike games, where you move from room to room solving puzzles, fighting bosses, and collecting loot, and it's not a particularly forgiving game. so if you don't come prepared, you can get completely demolished by a boss. But you get enough healing items that, as long as you're consistently spamming them as you fight, it isn't overly difficult, so you're not going to get stuck for a bunch of hours usually. One thing that doesn't really hold up to the test of time is the interface. Swapping equipment, using items, and using spells is a big old pain in the ass, which is nothing new to people who played games back in the 2000s, but for those coming to it for the first time now, it takes a bit of getting used to. Not an insurmountable hurdle, but it definitely can test your patience a bit, have you yelling at your screen to hurry up. Luckily, there are enough systems to mess around in that the fun factor in experimentation is pretty high. I enjoyed messing around with different encounters, using different equipment, testing out new spells and new weapons as I got them, much in the same way that I would find enjoyment doing the same thing in a game like Dark Souls and Elden Ring. And there's a ton of different pieces of equipment, spells, abilities, and break arts, enough that you could spend countless hours just unlocking and finding all of them. For some people, I think that would be enough to keep you playing by itself. I think Vagrant Story does require a bit of mental prep work before you start it up. It isn't a fast-paced game for the most part, and there are definitely going to be moments of frustration. But it doesn't necessarily feel like an old relic of the past, like a lot of the games that are on the PS1. A lot of the fun comes from choosing how you fight. You eventually gain the ability to craft weapons, and a lot of the focus goes into figuring out what works best for each situation. There are enemies that have certain weaknesses you will need to exploit, whether that's by being at a certain range, using a certain set of abilities, or just running around a pillar a bunch of times. Vagrant Story still has a lot to offer someone coming into it for the first time today. You'll get a unique experience that, for the most part, doesn't exist in the rest of the gaming landscape, in some of the best ways. I'd say it would be best to measure your expectations coming into it, because there are a lot of people that played Vagrant Story when they were young, and because of that, they'll insist that you enjoy it. But I think this one stands the test of time. Definitely worth the playthrough even now. There hasn't been any sort of remaster or remake, so you're gonna have to find a way to play it however you can. So for the question of whether Vagrant Story is worth playing today, the answer is definitely yes. It is worth playing, you should find that way to play it, and you should pick it up. It is going to be a bit more slow-paced, so if that's not really your thing, then maybe you won't enjoy it as much. But for people who really enjoy digging into systems and finding loot and exploring abilities and all of these things, it is definitely something that you would enjoy.